One of the experiences I trust every homebrewer shares is the feeling of awe that comes from witnessing the conversion of wort into beer through the fermentation process. Even after 15 years, I still get giddy when I see the first signs of airlock activity, a nice fluffy kreuzen developing on top of my beer. The worst is when this takes too long. You all know the anxiety that comes from checking on a batch a day after pitching and seeing no action. This is why we love Imperial Yeast, who pack 200 billion cells of the purest yeast into each pitch-right pouch, which assures quick starts, healthy fermentation, and predictably great results. I strongly urge all of our listeners to check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer and let them know that you appreciate their support of the Brewlosophy podcast while you're at it. All right, on to the show. Brewing is a fairly convoluted process that involves numerous measurements to ensure the batch turns out just as we planned. One such measurement is pH, which is said to impact various aspects of the finished beer. And while most brewers tend to focus on mash pH, there are other areas where it's important as well. This is the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss the method of adjusting the pH of wort following the boil prior to pitching yeast, specifically with Sauergut, is contributor Jordan Folks.
You know, if I was to use one word to describe my brewing, it'd probably be convoluted. And I think that the use of post-boil acidification with wacky things like Sauergut is a great example of just how convoluted I've kind of taken this whole hobby.
Yeah, and I think that part of it is that you find joy in kind of tapping into the traditional sides of brewing and seeing, exploring exactly what these kind of arguably older methods like using Sauergut, that how they're going to impact your beer. Now, I started paying attention to water chemistry around a decade ago, and back then this just included me adjusting the brewing liquor prior to mashing in with acid in order to hit the proper mash pH, or the pH that's recommended by other brewers, basically. Like most, my method for doing this involved the use of store-bought acids. It always worked, but I was certainly intrigued to learn about the arguably more, natural method of acidification via Sauergut. I look forward to chatting about this today, as well as the impact adjusting wort pH post-boil with this stuff has on a German Pils. If you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. This month's guest is Brewlosophy's resident sensory analysis, who actually earns an income as the sensory manager at John I. Haas, Jeff Daly. Jeff has been a longstanding friend of Brewlosophy who regularly joins Cade on the Brew Lab podcast to dig into the work that he's doing on hops. And we're really excited for him to join us again for this month's live Q&A. If you want to be a part of this session, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday, March 29th, 2024, as Jeff's going to be taking questions that Saturday, the 30th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allow you to leave those ratings and reviews, we really would appreciate it, as it helps those who have yet to hear of us more easily find the show. Plus, we like knowing what you think. All right, feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches. Jordan, you're using their 240-volt 10-gallon setup, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really puts the effort into ensuring that their systems do exactly what they're intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. If you're not ready to make the jump to electric yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits. If you've been considering going electric, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Now, real quick, as predicted last week, we ended up getting quite a bit of feedback from last week's episode where we shared our views on the AHA and the recent changes announced to HomebrewCon. As such, and given how, big of a topic this is, I do think that we'll record a follow-up episode where we share some of that feedback and offer even more of our thoughts on how things are going. I'll be honest, I've learned a lot of interesting information since then. It's just a matter of determining the best way to talk about that. Anyway, if you have thoughts after listening to that episode, please do not hesitate to send them to us at feedback@brewlosophy.com. We may very well include your email on that upcoming episode. All right, listener and Brewlosophy patron Sean Carney from Galway, Ireland wrote in with some general feedback, something it seems we've been getting quite a bit more of lately, in fact. Sean said, I finally caught up with all of the Brewlosophy podcasts and wanted to say thanks for all the time and effort you guys have put into this. My dad got a brewing kit as a Christmas present back in December of 2021, and we decided to give it a try mid-2022. We started with extract, then moved to extract with grains, and finally onto all grain. So far, we've made over 20 batches of beer, cider, and wine. It has become such a rewarding hobby, and I really enjoy getting to share with my dad. The podcasts, Patreon, and articles have massively improved my enjoyment of the hobby by taking the stress out of it all. I've tried a number of these methods, and my beers have continued to improve. What great feedback. What do you think, Jordan?
I'm so glad that we're able to provide a valuable resource of information for brewers across the world, and trying to keep it fun. And so it really is a community, and I think that the enjoyment is really on both sides of the airwaves, as it were.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, that's something that I talked about in last week's episode as well, is that, I think a lot of people presume because we use a scientific approach or scientific terminology, that's largely just driven by our interest in the more scientific, empirical ways of doing things in general. But I commented last week that really what we're after is having fun, is making this hobby something that's more approachable, hopefully at least, and having fun with it and not being afraid to step outside of what's normal. I mean, Jordan, you're one of the most traditional brewers I've ever met, and you're still a part of Brewlosophy. I mean, that's part of the message that we want to send, right?
Yeah, the way I look at it is brewing can be as complicated or as simple as you want it to be, and it's all about what you want, right? And so if 1 hour brew days and fermenting lager yeast at 80 degrees is your jam and you're liking the output, go for it, right? On the flip side, if you want to do triple decoctions and yeast starters and pure oxygen and adding zinc on the cold side, ad nauseum, that's cool too. And whether it's making the best beer possible in the most rigorous way possible, or making beer that you think is great, as quick and easy as possible, there's many ways to the same end goal of making beer at home.
Exactly, to skin a cat, as it were, Jordan. I couldn't agree more. So, I had the pleasure of visiting Galway a few years ago when I was out in Ireland for their National Homebrew Club conference. My wife and I ended up renting a car in Dublin and drove around the country the week after that event ended. I'm telling you, driving on the other side of the road takes some getting used to. It's actually quite anxiety provoking, and that's coming from somebody who doesn't get anxious about much. So absolutely gorgeous city on the water there. We had so much fun, and I cannot wait to get back. More importantly, though, Sean, thank you so much for those kind words. It really is amazing to hear from people who are especially relatively new to the hobby, given how rough things have been lately with, talk of people kind of exiting the hobby right now. So you kick ass. I'm glad that whatever it is that we're doing is contributing to your enjoyment of this, and keep on making the best beer that you can. I'm beyond pleased to hear that we've had some role in you feeling better about this hobby and enjoying it, as much as you do. So if you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. If you haven't already, please go subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, at youtube.com/@TheBrewlosophyShow. That's the @ symbol followed by The Brewlosophy Show with no umlaut. Martin is producing all sorts of rad content over there, and we're confident you're going to enjoy it very, very much. Alrighty, when we're back from this break, our focus will be on post-boil pH adjustments with Sauergut. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Fargo, the new virtual assistant from Wells Fargo, makes banking faster and easier. Like this.
Fargo, what's my checking account routing number?
And this.
Fargo, turn off my debit card.
And this.
Fargo, what did I spend on groceries last month?
And that's just the beginning. Do you, Fargo? You can. In the Wells Fargo mobile app. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/getfargo.
Terms and conditions apply. Your mobile carrier's availability and message and data rates may apply. Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
Waiting on a tax return? Hopefully it ends up in your hands. Fraudulent tax returns due to identity theft increased by 30% in 2023. If you're in a bind this tax season, LifeLock can help. Our U.S.-based restoration specialists are experts dedicated to helping solve your identity theft issues. And all LifeLock plans are backed by the $1 Million Protection Package. So we'll reimburse you up to the limits of your plan if you lose money due to identity theft. Help protect your information this tax season with LifeLock. Save up to 25% your first year at LifeLock.com/aware.
As I imagine is the case for most brewers, my initial view of brewing water chemistry was that it's pretty overwhelming, as it seemed to involve so many different things, the most daunting of which, in my opinion at least, had to be pH. I soon learned it's not nearly as scary as it seemed at first, and began making adjustments to my brewing liquor to ensure my mash was at the proper or recommended pH within that range, which typically involved acidification with either lactic or phosphoric acid. As the years went on, I began to hear from brewers who claimed that adjusting the pH of the wort following the boil, yet prior to pitching yeast, had some benefit as well. And on top of that, talk of using Sauergut as a more natural alternative to store-bought acids also increased. Now, we've done episodes on acidification in the past, so I do apologize if there's any redundancy in this episode, but I feel like it's important to at least cover some of the basics up front.
Right. And so I think the first question we should ask is, what is pH? And I'm curious, Marshall, does that even stand for anything? Because I don't actually know if it's just like two letters put together, if it like is short for something.
Yeah, it's like fat, like fat with a P, man. No, my understanding is that pH is first off, it's a reference to how acidic or basic a certain liquid solution is. So I think most people who've taken high school chemistry understand that, but the P and the H of pH stand for potential of hydrogen. And what it is a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions in a substance. I'm not a chemist here. I'm not entirely sure if more basic means more hydrogen ions and less basic means, or more acidic means less hydrogen ions. I do believe that's what it is, but I could be mixing those up. But yeah, it stands for potential of hydrogen. What I'm confused about is why the P is always lowercase and the H is uppercase. I guess it makes it look unique enough to be a scale of measure. But anyways, that's what it stands for. Again, just to reiterate, you got 7.0 is your neutral point. So a solution, let's say, water that has it, which water is usually a little bit more on the basic side of things. That's what you would expect or want. But let's say you've got a solution that's exactly 7.0. That's neutral. It's neither acidic nor basic. If you go lower than 7.0, you're now into the acidic range. So you're looking at like lemon juice or the acids that we use in brewing even. You go higher than 7.0 and you start to push into more basic solutions. And I guess a good example of an extremely basic solution would be something like bleach or chlorine.
Right. And so pH exists in everything, right? Your body has a pH, your blood, your saliva, whatever, you could probably measure the pH of the liquid you could squeeze out of a plant, etc. Right. And so naturally pH has implications for beer in the brewing process. And so what we generally see is a gradual decline throughout the brewing process. So if your water is about 7, once you add grains, then you're going to be below 7 in your mash. The boil might have some level of pH drop associated with it. Fermentation, we tend to see a pH drop. Carbonic acid, the carbonation process might then drop it even more. lest we, not ignore acidification via, souring processes, et cetera, to make sour beer, which further reduces the pH. So really mining your pH throughout the process is important here. And I think that as brewers, we kind of start with our water and just understanding what that is. And then once we add the grains in for the mash, we want to make sure that that mash pH is in that ideal range for conversion, ostensibly flavor production, efficiency, etc.
Exactly. And I think I would have to contend that most brewers, when they hear pH come up, their mind probably automatically goes to mash pH, unless they're sour beer brewers, of course. I mean, the acidic beers, you're paying way more attention to titratable acidity and then also pH, because of the finished product. But for the most part, if we're brewing standard beer, we're focusing we hear pH, we think of mash pH, and you want to keep it in that 5.2 to 5.6 range. That's kind of the Goldilocks zone, apparently, for mash pH. We've done experiments on that as well. Now, there are certain things that will affect your mash pH, and I know this is not an episode focused on mash pH, but I feel like we have to talk about it because it's like what we're getting to, which is post-boil pH adjustment, is affected by your mash pH as well. So typically, people who are brewing darker styles of beer, the darker the beer goes, the less likely the need is going to be to acidify your mash, right? To adjust the mash with acids, exogenous acids, because darker malts are more acidic. The more roasted a malt is or a grain is, the more acidic it's going to be. And so that's going to pull that pH down as well. Sometimes to a point where you might need to add a more basic solution to increase your mash pH. Now, there's a lot of controversy, I guess. It's not terribly controversial, but, differing opinions about the need to do this stuff in terms of mash pH, particularly when making darker styles. We've all heard about capping the mash to avoid that pH drop up front because you want to encourage the most conversion and all of that stuff. So now beers that are made with a majority of lighter or paler malts are typically going to have, depending on your starting water, if you're starting with RO or distilled, those are typically going to have a slightly higher pH to the point that it could be outside of that Goldilocks zone. It might push 5.8 or even 6.0 pH, and that is ostensibly too high for the best conversion and, like you said, Jordan, potentially flavor development.
Right. Yeah. And as someone that mainly brews pale beers, I'm typically I always have to add acid in those beers, right? And there's various sources like I've messed around with them all: lactic, phosphoric, citric, acid malt, and then Sauergut, which I think that we'll kind of dig into what that exactly means. But occasionally I brew a dark beer and it's the exact opposite, and I've got to use something like pickling lime to get that back into the right zone. So I think that probably a lot of home brewers brew more pale beers than dark beers. So I think that the topic of dialing in your pH via acid sources is a pretty relevant conversation for this hobby.
Yeah, without a doubt. And something to just point out is that your pH will be affected by everything that you put. I mean, I say everything to try to make a point here. The minerals that you add to your mash or to your strike water, to your brewing liquor, are going to affect the pH. Hopping rates in the kettle are going to affect the pH of the wort. All of these things have some sort of an effect on pH. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, before we get into the different ways of adjusting mash pH or pH in general, what have you heard are some of the issues on a perceptible level that can occur if you don't? I'm just curious what you've heard if you don't mash at the proper pH, because my big thing was what I used to hear all the time was conversion, ensuring that you have created the most optimal environment for those enzymes to do what it is we want them to do. How, kind of down the path there, how does that, manifest itself on a perceptible level?
Right. Well, I got to say, once I started minding my water chemistry, my beers got better. And so maybe there is something there. Part of it is where I live, right? The water, if I didn't add acid, it would be a really high mash pH. In fact, remember, Marshall, I did that, my first short and shoddy, I didn't adjust the water and the mash was like 6.5 or something like that,
Yeah.
And that beer sucked. Whether it was that or not, I don't know. But they say that if your mash pH gets too high, you could make an astringent beer. And I think also on the darker side of things, that if your mash pH isn't right, you could have an acrid beer with the use of roasted grains in a solution that doesn't have the optimal pH zone. But something we learned on last week's episode of the Brew Lab, where Cade interviewed Dr. Laura Burns from Omega Yeast, is she talked about the various drivers of attenuation, and apparently that mash pH is not only helping efficiently convert your grains so that you're using less to get more, but also it helps drive attenuation. And a non-ideal mash pH could have poorer attenuation. And I like dry beer, and whether or not there's a perceptible difference in a sweet versus dry finishing gravity, I think that it's at the very least a best practice in insurance.
No, without a doubt. And the reason I ask is because I think a lot of people, I forget what the term is for the kind of logical fallacy that people make when, you've done 15 different things and you notice a difference in your finished beer and you're like, oh, you got to do all 15 of those now. It's part of what informs the way we approach our experiments, is trying to isolate single variables to see. I'm not convinced that mash pH has a huge perceptible impact. That's just based on my own experiences and some of the experiments we've done in the past. But one thing that we've been able to observe is it does really seem to have some effect, at least, on conversion. So for that alone, given how easy it is to adjust, your brewing liquor prior to mashing in, it seems to me like a worthwhile thing, particularly for those who want that drier beer, who want to ensure the optimal attenuation once you pitch your yeast. So now, typically when people are adjusting pH, whether it's during the mash or post boil, which we'll get to, they're using store-bought acids. I have to imagine that's the most popular way of going about it. You've got phosphoric acid, which really tends to come at like a 10% strength, so not terribly strong, which can make making finer adjustments easier. And then there's lactic acid, which I believe comes at 40% and 88% strength. 88% is what you're going to find at more beer and places like that. And that is, given how strong it is, you have to be really deft with your measurements unless you want to go overboard. You have to add water back and then, do that whole dance. But lactic acid tends to be stronger, phosphoric a little bit, not so strong. And then there's citric acid, which I don't think many brewers are using, though I've definitely heard from a few who prefer citric acid. I'm not sure what the strength of that is. Again, there's also acid malt or acidulated malt, same thing. And that is was a product, my understanding is, at least, Jordan, that was a product developed again to kind of abide by the Reinheitsgebot or the beer purity law, because they're not allowed to use these exogenous acids. So what they do is they wet a bunch of, this is my understanding at least, they wet a bunch of malt, and then they let the lactic acid naturally kind of accumulate on it, and then they dry it out, and now it's there to acidify your mash. I heard a little birdie told me that nowadays a lot of maybe not so German maltsters are just spraying lactic acid over the top of the malt and selling it like that. So, well,
they all work well. Me personally, I find phosphoric a bit annoying in the sense of that it's so the strength is so low. You have to use like an entire jar or bottle per brew effectively, basically. Yeah. And so it's just like really inefficient. You're just like, it's the same cost as the strong stuff, but you have to use so much. So lactic acid, you're adding like 4 grams or something to a standard 5-gallon batch. Citric acid tends to be, I think, 88% strength, and it's actually a powder. Pretty easy to use. And I think a lot of people are preferring that for hop water. And acid malt, also super easy to use. I used to use it all the time. I can't remember if it was like 1 to 2% of the grist. And then it's just part of your milling process. Super easy. So Sauergut, though, that can get a little complicated. Maybe it's time to talk about what that is, how it's made, and how you use it relative to kind of the standard homebrew arsenal of acidification techniques.
Oh, absolutely. I can't wait to talk about Sauergut. The thing about it is that in part because it's the focus of this episode, I feel like it deserves a little bit more attention than just including it among this list. So let's put a pin in that for 1 second and break down some of the reasons why somebody might want to adjust the pH of their wort post boil prior to pitching the yeast. Now, this is something that I first heard of, 5 years ago from ex-contributor Malcolm Fraser, who I believe he did an experiment on it, kind of similar to the one that we're going to get to here in a bit. But it wasn't something that was talked about very much in my brewing circles. Him proposing it was when right about the time he was moving into the professional world of brewing. And I thought, oh, maybe this is something they do and it has some other, important reason, at least on the commercial scale, but it's not something homebrewers are really doing very much. That does seem to have shifted a bit. I hear about post-boil pH adjustments a lot more these days than I used to, pre 5 years ago. What are some of the reasons you have opted to employ this method, Jordan?
Yeah, there's really two primary styles in which I've heard it has a benefit specifically, and they happen to be the two styles I brew the most. So, and maybe three, and I'll talk about all three. So the first for lagers is I started hearing about it when I was getting into the low-dough scene, and it was just one of the techniques that the low-oxygen brewers recommended was post-boil acidification, ostensibly stealing the idea from German brewers. And I believe that it basically, we expect to see a pH reduction during the fermentation process. And so if we can get a little bit of a jump start to that ideal range, it just improves the yeast performance. It perhaps, at the very least, maybe it lessens the tank time associated with it. There's probably some sort of low oxygen benefit associated with it, like protein coagulation, et cetera, is improved at an ideal pH when in a world where we're trying to rack clear beer in the fermenter. So we want to really promote precipitation of any particulates during the settling stage. But honestly, I was kind of just following what I heard on the internet and didn't necessarily, I figured it's easy enough, right? Why not add a little acid? But for hoppy beers, it was supposed to be really important. And I heard about that on a podcast interview with Julian from Beechwood, and talking about how they found that their hoppy beers were improved when they acidified following knockout. And there are some really hard science reasons for that. And it's associated with the observed increase in pH from heavy dry hop loads. So for dry hopped beers, if we can, hedge our bets on the front end and just reduce the pH ahead of time, knowing that there will be inevitable pH rise, we can make the beers crisper, snappier, and you're trying to avoid this kind of flabby effect when you have too high of a pH. And there's been some MBAA research on this matter, and I heard that they recommended this study that was done, you could go down to as low as like 4 pH as your knockout pH adjustment with a super high dry hop load, because you're going to see such an aggressive increase following that dry hop. So the last one is sour beer. A bit of a special consideration here is if you're doing a kettle sour or a lambic spontaneous style fermentation, there is often a recommendation to go ahead and reduce that pH below the danger zone. So you're just not picking up any things you don't want during that initial acidification process. That's a bit of a special consideration. And I just want to throw that out there, but I don't think we need to talk too much about sour beer.
And that danger zone is 4.5, right? If I recall correctly, or
I think so, and I'm going to brew a lambic today, so I'm glad you reminded me, because I think I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I'm going to use Sauergut, by the way, in my lambic. I think that'll be fun.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't wait to talk more about Sauergut, because I think it's really interesting when you compare it to these other sources of acidification. I'm with you. The only thing, I've got a degree, a PhD from YouTube University, and what I learned about the reason people acidify wort post-boil is exactly as you said. The main reason is to ensure that the end product is perceptibly more crisp and drinkable. As you increase pH, you start to get a little bit more of a rounded, kind of a warmer, I call it warmer, and people don't understand what I mean by that, but kind of the perception of like this round, flabby, not so tight and crisp flavored product. And so by adjusting the wort prior to pitching the yeast, not only are you making the wort arguably more favorable for fermentation for the yeast, but you're also ensuring that by the end of the fermentation process, which will impact your pH even further, that the end result isn't going to be this kind of flabby, less desirable end product. So that's what I've heard. I think the main reason people are doing it, though, is more for yeast performance and fermentation. Like you said, the coagulation of proteins, the ensuring the best environment for attenuation, all of that stuff. So, but if there is a perceptible outcome, I would contend that at least some people would argue that it's going to be even more perceptible if you use a good source of acidification. And in some circles, Sauergut is the only way to go. They've heard, now we're going to talk about how to make this stuff very generally, but what I've read is that adherents to Sauergut contend that it is one of the things required in order to get that traditional German, quote, it flavor into styles like pale lager.
I am absolutely a believer in this. And in fact, Kay did an experiment. I gave him some Sauergut before I was on the Brewlosophy crew, because we both live in the same state. And he did it on a Kolsch. And sure enough, it was significant. And he preferred the Sauergut version, I think, relative to lactic acid. And this is very interesting because phosphoric, lactic, acid malt, maybe citric. There's maybe an argument that maybe citric has a little bit of an effect there in terms of flavor. These are neutral acids that are not supposed to make any sort of flavor. There's concerns that some lactic might smell like butter, and maybe that's like a bad batch. But generally speaking, these are neutral acids. Sauergut has a flavor. And if you ever have a authentic German example, like I had a Bavik Pilsner on draft last night at a bar, it was so Sauergut forward. And once you start to brew with it or taste it in examples, you really can taste Sauergut present. Ondex Helles is another great example of a very Sauergut forward beer. It has a flavor and I love it. And I really think it's part of German lager flavor, but maybe it wouldn't be appropriate in an IPA, right? And so it is kind of weird. And I think that there are certain styles it works for, and maybe it's not a universal ingredient though, like lactic, that's more neutral.
But I agree with you. I don't know the beers that I've had that have been made with, again, like a lot of topics we've talked about, I've never used Sauergut. But it does make sense to me that it would impart some flavor, because essentially all it is wort that you have intentionally soured with natural lactobacillus, right? Because that's on brewing grains. I'll let you talk a little bit more how to make this stuff. But what I'm curious about is, you look at lactic acid, which is 88% acidity or acid. You look at 10% phosphoric, 88% citric, whatever that is. I want to know, like, how strong does this stuff get?
Right. And so making it at home, it's a bit of a shot in the dark. And I made it at home a few times. And then I had a batch that went bad. And at that point, I was like, is there an easier way? And it turns out you can just buy it from Wireman. They don't sell it to homebrewers. So you have to like throw down with your homebrew buddies and like get an entire commercial box. And so I have one. The home stuff, I think the recommendation is assume like 1 to 2 or 3% acid maybe. And so you got to use a lot. And so it makes sense that if you're adding an entire gallon of soured wort to a mash, that's going to have a taste effect when you're compared to 4 grams or 4 milliliters of a neutral lactic acid.
Okay, so it's interesting because you commented earlier that what you don't like about phosphoric is it requires the use of quite a bit. I have to imagine that's because that means you have to buy more. Whereas with Sauergut, you're actually the fact that you're adding more is ostensibly contributing to the flavor profile of the beer. So that's a good thing. And so in that respect, again, correct me if I'm wrong, you're cool with adding a lot of it.
Yeah, well, that's a good point, right? And so the Wireman product is 5.5% acid. And this is the one request I have for Brewfather, which is a great app because, it's on your phone, it's on the computer, they're all linked. And when you type in your grains and stuff, you can then adjust the water chemistry without having to switch to another platform like we did with Bruin Water, which was an awesome product. Still love that one, but I love the embedded feature within Brewfather. Unfortunately, you can't specify Sauergut as the label. So for listeners that might be looking at my recipes, you might see lactic acid 5.5% acid strength in the Brewfather recipe. That's because you can't adjust the strength of the acid at the very least. They just don't have a label for Sauergut. So I'm using Sauergut at 5.5% from Wireman, but it's a big box and it takes me like 2 years to get through the box. So, and it's affordable, right? So I'm okay with the amount that I have to use relative to phosphoric, which is basically an entire $10 or whatever tube per batch. It's just kind of expensive to use relative to the phosphoric relative to the other ones. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. Now, if you wanted to make your own, I looked up pretty simple recipes online. You're basically going to make a small batch of simple wort. You can use DME just like you would, for a yeast starter. And then you add a handful of uncrushed malt to it and let that sour. And then you basically, it's kind of like a Solara. You just kind of keep that going, right? You feed it with more wort whatever you take out, you replace with more fresh wort, and then let that sour, and then you can use that again. And it kind of creates this cycle. Is that kind of the way that it's supposed to work?
Yeah, but there's a specific temperature you want to hold it out, which is basically kettle souring temp. Let's say 95, 100 degrees Fahrenheit or so. But the other thing is you got to keep oxygen out. And so that's what happened one time, is I was having great success. It's a really potent flavor that it provides because the Wireman product on the flip side is concentrated, and it pours like liquid malt extract. And so you don't need to use as much by volume because of that concentrated approach, right? It's very sticky and it's very difficult to pour, by the way. It's like thick as molasses. But the homemade stuff is liquid, right? Truly a liquid. And so you have to use quite a bit. And it does provide a good flavor, but you run the risk of it turning bad via oxygen infection, for lack of a better way to describe it, right? And it turned like gray and it was disgusting. And so that is the difficult thing about making it at home. You got to get your temp right and you got to keep oxygen out.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, especially with souring bacteria like that, we know that these things are affected by oxygen, the presence of oxygen. So now some pros to using Sauergut over other forms of exogenous acid. First off, it abides by the Reinheitsgebot. So if that's something you care about, use Sauergut or acid malt, I suppose. But it's also believed to impart this desirable quality to beer. Like you said, Jordan, you feel like you can taste it, especially the lighter that beer gets. And if you're moving into, German lagers, this is the way to do it. So it purportedly encourages increased extraction of zinc, which is a yeast nutrient from the malt. And it's said to improve body and the foam quality of beer. So, but just by using this product to adjust your mash and or post-boil beer, you can get all of these benefits out of it. Is there anything else that you can think of that is kind of a benefit of using Sauergut that we haven't talked about?
No, two things, right? It does the job. Logistically, it reduces the pH that we want to do, but it has a flavor associated with it. And, some people say it's like this kind of like grape-like flavor. And, it's kind of like Sauergut tastes like Sauergut, and it's kind of hard to describe. But maybe another way to say it is Sauergut tastes like German lager, pale lager, right? Like it's just this thing, right? And it's so good. And it's just that it's a nice little thing to turn your lager to 11, if you know what I mean.
There you go. Yeah, I like that. It's another one of those knobs that you can use to tweak the final outcome of your beer. In terms of cons, I don't think there aren't many. I mean, as you experienced, it can go bad if you don't treat it properly. But if you're buying the store-bought stuff from Wireman, then you're probably good to go. The thicker a substance gets, the less likely it is to be impacted by things like oxygen and particularly bacteria and stuff like that. So, and then the other thing is, like you mentioned, I guess the relative weakness of it, the fact that it's only 5.5% acid, you're going to need to use more, which means you're going to have to either make or buy more. But other than that, there's really nothing else, except for you may not like the quality that the perceptible quality that it contributes to beer, or specific styles of beer. You might just use it when you're making, pale lagers and stuff like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about German Pils, because I do feel like, one, that's the style you focused on in the experiment we're going to get to, but also it is kind of what we expect to see, German Pils, Munich Helles, stuff like that, Sauergut used in. So the BJCP describes this style as a pale, dry, bitter German lager featuring a prominent hop aroma, crisp, clean, and refreshing, showing a brilliant gold color with excellent head retention. Why would you want to adjust the pH of the wort prior to pitching the yeast, but after the boil in this style, Jordan?
Right. Two things. One is we already are using Sauergut in the mash ostensibly, right? And so why not add more? And maybe that is relevant here. And that was one of the kind of philosophies behind, or hypotheses behind this experiment, is if we've already added it in the mash, does then adding it to the post-boil actually increase the perception of the Sauergut flavor, or is it already locked in and it doesn't matter? Who knows? And that's what this experiment kind of looked to see. So adding more of that beautiful Sauergut flavor and reducing that pH so that we can have a ostensibly improved fermentation. And honestly, it's probably not necessary. We've been making beer without this post-boil pH forever and making great beer, but maybe it improves it. And so that's one of the things I wanted to see if we could even observe that in the experiment.
Absolutely. And so there's really two things we're looking at here. One is, does the adjusting the pH on its own have a perceptible impact? And if it does the flavor of it, is it representative of what you might expect or what one might expect from doing that adjustment with Sauergut? So these are the types of experiments I love, because a single variable, right? Post-boil adjustment with Sauergut, I guess that's two variables, but in doing that, what kind of an impact does it really have? So I've never acidified wort post-boil at all. I've never seen the need to do that, but I know quite a few folks who swear by it nowadays, especially for German lagers. When we come back from this break, we're going to be going over an experiment looking at exactly that, the impact post-boil acidification with Sauergut had on a German Pils.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle, as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you.
Fargo, the new virtual assistant from Wells Fargo, makes banking faster and easier. Like this.
Fargo, what's my checking account routing number?
And this.
Fargo, turn off my debit card.
And this.
Fargo, what did I spend on groceries last month?
And that's just the beginning. Do you, Fargo? You can. In the Wells Fargo mobile app. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/getfargo.
Terms and conditions apply. Your mobile carrier's availability and message and data rates may apply. Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
Waiting on a tax return? Hopefully it ends up in your hands. Fraudulent tax returns due to identity theft increased by 30% in 2023. If you're in a bind this tax season, LifeLock can help. Our U.S.-based restoration specialists are experts dedicated to helping solve your identity theft issues. And all LifeLock plans are backed by the $1 Million Protection Package. So we'll reimburse you up to the limits of your plan if you lose money due to identity theft. Help protect your information this tax season with LifeLock. Save up to 25% your first year at LifeLock.com/aware.
I have to imagine that of all of the brewers in the world, at least those outside of Germany, most have never used Sauergut. I just don't think it's a very popular product right now, if they've even heard of this stuff. So I only learned of it 5 or 6 years ago, and it was during that whole Lodo thing. Sauergut became this talked about approach to acidification of the mash. And that's because their whole goal, the Lodo goal or the low oxygen brewing goal, is to emulate classic German brewing approaches. While it's arguably more identifiable these days, it's still not very popular. I was talking to some people about this experiment just this week, and they were like, what the hell's that stuff? I know these aren't brewers necessarily or hardcore brewers. They've made a few batches, but still, it's just not that popular of a product. But if it has a positive impact on beer, especially based on what some users claim it does, perhaps more brewers would opt for it over other types of acid. Jordan, as a user of Sauergut, you were curious of its impact on a German Pils, particularly when used to adjust the wort post-boil, and you put it to the test.
Right. So since this would be a post-mash, post-boil experiment, I went ahead and did a single 10-gallon batch so that there were no variation would stem from potential differences in the mash and the boil. So single 10-gallon batch of German Pilsner, simple grist of 98% Barca Pilsner malt and 2% Carahel, both Weyermann products. Love a little bit of Carahel in a Pilsner or a Helles. Nice little tip there. Given that these were German brews and me being the traditionalist that I am, I did a step mash, 145F or 63C, then up to 160F or 71C, following with a mash out at 172F or 78C before I separated the grains from the sweet wort and proceeded to boil for 60 minutes. This is a Hallertau Mittelfrüh beer. Great hop for German Pils. I think my next one, I might want to experiment with some more hop varieties, maybe 3 or 4, kind of like an IPA, but just without the dry hopping, but blending in multiple German varieties. But for this one, it was all Mittelfrüh, and it was 60 grams of first wort hop, then 60 grams at 60 minutes, 69 grams at 10, 50 grams at 5, and then 50 grams at flame out. And I recall that I think this might have been like an entire pound bag was used for this 10-gallon batch.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Just as an aside, that does seem like a lot of hops for a German Pilsner. Do you typically throw in flame out additions in your German Pils?
I waver. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. If you check out the Lager book by Dave Carpenter, amazing book, by the way, for those that are interested in lager brewing. Freem Pils' recipe was provided for that, and they use a crap ton of hops in Freem Pils. And as you know, that beer is freaking amazing, and it doesn't taste like an IPA, right? And so, yes, tons of hops in a Pilsner, I think, is one way to go. On the flip side, Bierstadt Pilsner is like a 60-minute edition and a 40-minute edition, and that's it. And so there's different ways to get there, and Bierstadt Pilsner is freaking incredible. But I will add that one of the reasons that so many hops were used is that we've just seen really low alpha acid levels coming out of Europe over the last few years. And when your alpha acid's at 2% it takes a lot to hit those 35 IBUs or so that you might be shooting for in a Pils.
Yeah, without a doubt. And just to point out that the numbers that you gave, the 60 gram first wort hop and such for this batch was for the 10-gallon batch. This is not for a 5-gallon batch. So if you're writing it down or you're looking at the recipe on that article, make sure you keep in mind that that's for the 10-gallon batch. So I love it. I've had beers that were hopped, or like German Pils and hopped this way, and I've had German. I love Bierstadt. I love Freem. They're both amazing. The beauty of homebrewing is that you could try them both out for yourself and have some variety, or settle on the one that you like the most. So now you finished the boil. Where did you go from there in the brew day?
Right. And so this had to get a little tricky, right? Because I got to introduce the variable now, a post boil. So normally you add the Sauergut to your kettle at flame out, right? And you stir it in or whirlpool it in or whatever you might do. So how I emulated that, given the need to mix this like syrup with wort, hot wort to dilute it, is I pulled about 2 gallons or about a half gallon of hot wort into 2 separate fermentation kegs, one of which I then added sufficient Sauergut to achieve 5.1 pH. And we didn't really talk about that actually, but that is kind of the rule of thumb, is you're trying to reduce the pH in this lager Sauergut method to below 5.1 or so. And so 5.0, 5.05, 4.9, something in that range is good. And so for a 5-gallon batch, rule of thumb is something in the range of like 75 grams or so of Sauergut should get you there with normal pHs. But obviously do the math, use Brewfather, use Brew and Water to double check that. So that's what I did, is I just went ahead to I pulled off both just so somehow the addition of a little bit of hot wort in the bottom of the fermentation keg wasn't what was driving this difference, that in fact it was the acidification of the batch.
Yeah, and that's what we do, right? We do everything we can to keep these batches treated identically so that we can isolate that variable. And if there is a difference, we can say, hey, the only reasonable explanation here is because of the variable that we were testing. Now, just to reiterate, so it's very clear, you would normally just add the Sauergut to the kettle of hot wort before chilling it, but because you were splitting this wort, you racked 2 liters of that hot wort over to a keg. You did that to both kegs, but in one of them was this amount of Sauergut, so that you would achieve, again, this is the part I want to be clear about, a 5.1 pH once you added the rest of the wort to it, or 5.1 pH of that 2 liters that you had at the bottom of the keg.
Right. Added enough that the entire filled keg would achieve that 5.1 pH.
Okay.
And so once this hot wort was added in both, and Sauergut was added to one, I swirled them both around to mix it into solution, turned the chiller on, and then sent chilled wort into these fermentation kegs, which are just corny kegs, that then mixed up the hot wort and in one case the Sauergut solution into the entire batch, getting me cool, but not cool enough. So I had to go ahead and throw it in a cool chamber for a few hours to get it to that lager pitch temp that I like. So like 46F or something like that. And ultimately, I took gravity measurements and I saw that I had identical OGs as we expected. The Sauergut didn't really impact the OG of 1054.
Yeah, that's perfect for a German Pils, in my opinion. I love, that's like the perfect OG for a nice, crushable, clean lager that will still get you feeling pretty good after a couple of them. Now, once these worts were chilled, this is the interesting part, for me at least, because it has to do with the variable. You also took a couple pH measurements.
Right. And so, sure enough, the Sauergut batch was at 5.12. And, there's probably a little bit of error associated with these pH meters. So call it 5.1. And then the no acidification was at 5.39, call it 5.4. And so what we see there is, given that I had acidified the mashes to 5.4, that we didn't see a really strong reduction in pH via the boil. We see it just kind of holds constant. And so at the very least, we can observe that adding Sauergut at flame out does reduce the pH of the solution.
Yeah, there we go. And so they're starting off at different pHs when you pitch the yeast. So you let these worts chill in your chamber for a few hours until they get down to, it looks on this one that your desired pitching temperature was 48 degrees Fahrenheit or 9 degrees Celsius. And you pitched 2 pouches of Imperial Yeast L13 Global into each of these. That's a nice, clean, simple, robust yeast that kind of does exactly what we expect from it. And then you left them there for a couple of weeks. I know that you typically like to do that gradual raise in temperature once it gets to a certain point, right?
Yeah. So again, check out the lager book for a detailed write-up on this, but it's the tasty method, as some homebrewers have called it. And you do the first 50% of attenuation at that lower 48F. And then at 50%, you raise it to 52. And then at 75%, you raise it to 57 Fahrenheit. And then for the final 10% of expected attenuation, you raise it to like 60, 62. And so I found that you can kind of like make that even easier. Go about a week at 48 or so, and then start, slowly raising the temp controller up to 60. The point being is that, so they say, is if we start fermentation cold, we can get that literally crisp, clean, ester-free lager character. And after a few days have passed, it's okay to go ahead and start raising it. And the time frame in which ester production would occur has already passed. And so this really helps ensure complete attenuation and diacetyl reduction by gradually raising that temp a little bit later.
Yeah, it's a very, very popular method. We've written about it on the website. A lot of people used it. I now just ferment warm, which I know is blasphemy to lager brewers. But anyways, you get to the end of this 2-week period that both of these beers are sitting at about 60F. Fermentation is complete at this point, and you take hydrometer measurements that showed both happen to finish at the same exact 1007 FG, which I think is interesting. What were your thoughts when you saw? I would have expected at least that the acidified, the batch that was acidified post boil with Sauergut would have maybe attenuated a little bit more, but maybe that's not something we'd expect to see.
Yeah, I thought it might have, and so it didn't, and that's interesting. And again, maybe it's an insurance thing. Maybe if something other was messed up, that like maybe the mash pH was bad or something, that this would have improved it. Who knows? And I didn't have like dual tilts collecting data every 15 seconds in both to observe fermentation speed and vigor in real time between the two. But at the very least, at the end of the day, they finished at the same FG. But what about pH? Because one might expect that there would be a pH difference.
Yeah, I'm certainly interested to find out. What did you find when you measured the pH of these fermented beers?
Sure enough, we did see a difference. The Sauergut batch finished at 4.35 pH, while the one that had no acidification finished at 4.44. Now, notably, pH is, I believe, a logarithmic scale, so it's not as simple as kind of basic math. But that is interesting that it was a 0.3, right, pH difference going into fermentation, but finished with only a 0.1 difference. So we've done some other experiments on, or at least one other experiment on post-boil acidification with an IPA, and notably in that case, tasters could tell a difference, and it was kind of astonishing how different they tasted, even though they were both good. But again, I believe in that one, we saw that fermentation really kind of heals all wounds, and there was an observable difference in pH in that example as well, but it was pretty tight. And so it's amazing that the fermentation does such a dramatic effect on pH reduction.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, they're not that different in terms of number of, pH points difference.
Well, I've often thought about what exactly it is contributing to the decrease in pH through fermentation. I think one thing that got pointed out to me a while ago is, well, yeast are producing alcohol, and they're also producing carbonation, CO2, which is carbonic acid, which is going to have an impact on pH. So in this, what's weird to me is that the Sauergut batch, there's almost like this buffering capacity, right, of the fermentation process, where the difference in pH I would almost expect for those to just kind of stay constant, the delta between the two. But that's not what we're seeing here. What we're seeing is that they're coming closer to each other. It's like that yeast is so powerful in bringing things to where it's supposed to be that it kind of does that. And I just find that really interesting. So at this point in your process, you cold crash the beers to 32 degrees Fahrenheit over a few days, pressure transfer them just like we do with all of our beers to CO2 purge serving kegs that you put in your kegerator, and you allowed to condition on gas for a couple of weeks. Because it's a lager, we could say you allowed them to lager on gas for a couple of weeks before they were ready for evaluation. Now, before we go into, serving these beers to our blind participants to try to distinguish the odd one out, we have a look at them ourselves. We do our own panel of kind of semi-blind triangle tests. But when you poured these beers next to each other, before even tasting them, Jordan, did you notice any differences in the way they looked at all?
No, they looked identical and they looked beautiful. That pale yellow, clear lager color and look that we want with that nice, thick white foam on top. And I think that at the time we were looking at these, they were, still moderately clear, but they did not appear to have any sort of effect on clarity as a function of the post-boil acidification, which maybe kind of surprised me that you would think that if the Lodo brewers promoting this, maybe it would also improve clarity.
Well, yeah. Well, not only clarity, but also I read an argument from a Lodo brewer years ago that they were saying that color, that true yellow color of a good German pale lager is in part a function of this entire approach. I would almost expect to see even just some slight difference in the way that these beers look color-wise, but I'm looking at the photo right now and they look identical to me. I mean, you serve me one, you serve me the next. Based on my eyes, what my eyes see, I'm thinking they're the same exact beer.
Well, and an important point of clarification there is these were not true Lodo beers. I didn't do all of the things to mitigate hot side aeration. I wasn't, blasting air through the mash or anything like that to promote hot side aeration, but I didn't go to the extent that a true Lodo brew would. And so, perhaps that helps explain the what we saw. But so that's what we saw. They looked similar, but did they taste and smell and have a mouthfeel similarity? And so I did 5 personal triangle tests, semi-blind, knowing the variable, but not knowing which beer was in which glass. And dang it, I got it right 2 of the 5 times. And even side by side, those were guesses. And side by side, they tasted the same. I really couldn't detect more acidity or an more prominent Sauergut note in either. They had that same beautiful Pilsner flavor, grainy, doughy malt notes supporting hop bitterness and a clean fermentation character. No off flavors, awesome Pilsner beer.
This, despite the fact you knew everything about these beers and had some idea of what to expect flavor-wise, given your love of Sauergut, German Pilsners. So I find that in and of itself pretty interesting, but really the real meat of what we're after is, can the blind participants tell these beers apart? I think obviously, given the fact that even biased old you, Jordan, didn't have couldn't detect these couldn't detect the difference in these beers consistently, we have some idea of where this is going. You serve these beers to 20 participants, out of which 11 would have had to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with some confidence that these beers do seem to be different on a perceptible level. In the end, how many people actually got it right?
Only 8, and that's not too far off from what we would expect from random chance, indicating that tasters cannot reliably tell two pilsners apart that were mashed with Sauergut, but one had additional Sauergut added at flameout to reduce that pH to 5.1.
Fascinating. I mean, and particularly given the results of the prior experiment on this that you mentioned with IPA, I just think it's a really interesting result. And, you know, what we can kind of imply from this these findings, one is that in this, very specific experience or experiment, that one, adjusting wort post-boil to a different pH level didn't seem to have an impact. And then two, layering on top of that, using Sauergut didn't seem to have an impact either. There was neither of those factors seemed to contribute to a very noticeable difference between these beers. And that is not what I expected when you were designing this experiment. I did not expect that. I have to imagine you're in the same boat.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if fermentation health was part of this, because they were cold fermented, right? And I pitched 2 packs of fresh imperial yeast global into them. Maybe if they only had 1 pack that was 6 months old, maybe we would have seen some fermentation improvements from the Sauergut. Who knows? But in this case, using a solid process otherwise, it just didn't have a big perceptible difference, not to mention the fact that we saw an observable difference about 0.1 pH between the two. So yeah, I mean, I'm continuing to do it these days, but it probably isn't that big of a deal. Like if I was to run out of Sauergut, it's going to be okay. At least I got the mash pH right.
Yeah. Well, and that's what was my next question is, did the results of this experiment and your personal experience with these beers, did it change your approach? And I think something that I think a good message to send out from time to time as the brewlosophers, as it were, is that, yeah, there are times we perform these experiments and it's a lot of times, in fact, where the results come back against what we presumed. And that doesn't always mean we're changing our ways. We often stick with the way that we were doing things. And in part because we recognize that this is just a single data point. And there are other data points out there that might call this into question. It's through doing, many, many replications on these same variables in different environments and such, different styles of beer or whatever that might be, that we start to come to some level of maybe I don't want to say truth because that'll piss some people off, but like we start to tickle the truth a little bit more about what the impact of these specific variables are. And when it comes to using Sauergut and particularly for post-boil, pre-fermentation, wort acidification, I'm just not sure there's a huge impact, at least on pale lager. And so I'm not going to start doing this in my brewing. It sounds like you're going to keep doing it. Now, this is usually where we would share some reader comments and offer a few responses, but we didn't get any comments on this experiment, which is incredibly rare. And at least in my opinion, could be a sign of how uncommon the use of Sauergut and maybe even post-boil wort acidification really is. Maybe I'm wrong about that. What do you think, Jordan?
Well, the fact that Weyermann doesn't sell it for home brewers is telling, and it's only available to professional brewers. It's this giant box, and you got to split it up with your homebrew club, and then how are you going to get it out of the box, and what are you going to put it in? So it's kind of a annoying product to deal with, and I really wish they did sell it to home brewers, but clearly the market demand isn't there yet.
Yeah, and I don't think it's going to be there anytime soon, unfortunately, given the downturn in things lately. But that is all the time we've got for this episode. Did you have any final comments, Jordan?
I really encourage people to play around with Sauergut. Make it at home, taste it, make sure it doesn't taste awful before you use it. Throw down with some home brewers. Maybe a pro brewer's using it. You can get a little jar of it to use at home. It's a wonderful product, and I really think you can make some of the best lagers at home using Sauergut.
Yeah, it really does kind of increase that DIY nature of brewing, which I think drives a lot of us to keep doing it. So that is all we've got for this episode. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where Brewlosophy's Cade Job takes you into the lab with brewing scientists to discuss the fascinating research they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode.
The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
Fargo, the new virtual assistant from Wells Fargo, makes banking faster and easier. Like this.
Fargo, what's my checking account routing number?
And this.
Fargo, turn off my debit card.
And this.
Fargo, what did I spend on groceries last month?
And that's just the beginning. Do you, Fargo? You can. In the Wells Fargo mobile app. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/getfargo.
Terms and conditions apply. Your mobile carrier's availability and message and data rates may apply. Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.